Welcome to today's webinar sponsored by WANFO USA entitled Why 2024 Will Be the Year of Oral Fluid Drug Testing. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's presentation. WANFO USA is a leading manufacturer of point-of-care tests providing rapid diagnostic and chronic disease management solutions to support the health and well-being of people everywhere. Their mission is to provide solutions that save lives, as well as improve quality of life. Safe Life toxicology products provide a wide range of tests and configurations to monitor drug use and/or misuse of a variety of settings. We'd like to thank them for sponsoring today's webinar. Today's presentation also pre-qualifies for continuing education from SHRM and from CCDAP for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety, and you'll receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for those credits. Today's presenter is Bill Current, the president and founder of Current Consulting Group. Bill is the author of Why Drug Testing, Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance abuse related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance and business development consulting in the drug testing industry. And we'll now go ahead and turn the microphone over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation, Why 2024 Will Be the Year of Oral Fluid Testing. And I usually do, upwards of about 50 or so presentations a year, either in person or virtually through webinars and podcasts and whatnot. And this is definitely one of the 3 hot topics for 2024, oral fluid testing. It really started last year for a variety of reasons, some of which I'm going to cover in today's presentation. But I would say oral fluid testing, anything, of course, to do with the legalization of marijuana and its impact on workplace, drug-free workplace efforts. And probably on that top 3 list would be the new laws in California and Washington. Those are just getting a tremendous amount of attention. And it all sort of overlaps with oral fluid testing. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today. You can see the agenda there in front of you. I'm going to go through a lot of this. Please submit questions. Use the chat function or the Q&A function on the screen and ask any questions that you would like about today's topic or anything related to it, and I'll be happy to address those with you. But we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump into it. We're going to talk about oral fluid testing and why 2024 will be the year of oral fluid testing. And I want to start out with 3 2023 trends that are going to have and are already having a direct and significant impact on drug testing in 2024. First, as so many of you I'm sure know, the U.S. Department of Transportation issued final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing in 2023. It's still pending a lot of different things, including the certification of at least 2 laboratories, but that was big news in 2023. Really the first time in over 30 years that the federal government, DOT specifically, issued some type of regulation allowing for the use of some other testing method besides lab-based urine testing. So that's number 1. Number 2, the legalization of marijuana continues to spread across the country, and we're seeing more and more language in those legal marijuana laws and the bills that are being introduced that would have an impact on drug-free workplace programs, drug testing in particular. Last year, we saw Minnesota and Ohio legalize recreational marijuana. What we're seeing now, because so many states have either medical or recreational or both types of legal marijuana laws, what we're seeing now are a lot of bills that would amend or change those existing legal marijuana laws. And some of those changes have a direct impact on drug testing or what employers can do with a drug test result. So that's trend number 2. And trend number 3 directly is California and Washington. 2 new drug testing laws, or really marijuana laws that have a direct impact on and a significant impact on drug testing for marijuana in those 2 states. Both of those laws went into effect on January 1st this year. But those 3 trends from last year have carried over into 2024 and will will affect how employers do drug testing throughout this year. And we'll be generating lots and lots of questions. I did a webinar about a week or so ago now on just specifically on California and Washington's new laws. And we had over 1,000 people register for it. I allowed 15 minutes, so I only spoke for 45, and then I allowed 15 minutes for Q&A. This was through NDASA, an NDASA webinar sponsored by Quest Diagnostics. And in 15 minutes of Q&A, we didn't even come close to going through all the questions that were asked. We went 5 minutes over and still just had to cut it off because we were past our time. And I just recently went through 89 additional questions that were asked. So that's a hot topic. That's going to continue to be a hot topic throughout 2024. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in today's presentation because it's part of what I see as the sort of justification for saying that 2024 will be the year of oral fluid testing. I think it's going to go beyond 2024, but within the context of today's presentation, we'll talk about 2024. Now, at the Current Consulting Group, we've been in business. This is our 26th year in business, and from the very beginning, we have been conducting surveys of the drug testing industry. We do two major surveys every year, the Drug Testing Industry Survey and the Employer Drug Testing Survey. And so the Drug Testing Industry Survey, which is in motion now for the 2024 issue of the survey, which we'll present at the NDASA conference in May. In 2022, when we conducted the Drug Testing Industry Survey, we asked providers, so companies that provide drug testing services, if they were offering oral fluid testing. And we asked that question every year, as well as other testing methods. And you can see that between 2019 and 2022, the percentage of providers who say they offer oral fluid testing surged from 36% in 2019 to nearly 86% in 2022. And in last year's survey, we asked the question, in the future, which drug testing will be most used? Again, these are providers, and 46% said urine and 46% said oral fluid testing. So for the very first time in all the many surveys that we've done, oral fluid testing and urine testing tied as the number one predicted drug testing method among drug testing providers. Now, 10 years ago, oral fluid testing would have been nowhere close to urine testing, but that's an indication of the acceptance within the drug testing industry of oral fluid testing. And probably a lot of that had to do with the fact that in 2019, SAMHSA issued final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing of federal employees. And then in 2023, DOT issued its final regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. And even though many employers that do drug testing are not covered under the DOT regulations, they're nonetheless influenced by what the government says in terms of how to conduct drug testing. And so these new lab-based oral fluid testing regulations from the Department of Transportation have for sure influenced the industry and providers, even to the point now where we're equally divided between urine and oral fluid testing as the predicted drug testing method of the future. And so that's a very significant development. Now, we also asked employers in our 2023 survey, which we released at the annual meeting of SAPA, what were the drug testing challenges? What were the obstacles? What were the things that made it more difficult to do drug testing? And you can see right at the top, neck and neck, marijuana legalization and getting results in a timely manner. A lot of that sort of carrying over from 2020 when COVID took a direct hit on a lot of things like supply chain and how quickly drug testing laboratories were able to turn around results, how quickly collection sites were able to get donors in to void samples, et cetera. And you can see the number 3 challenge was arranging collections and a lot of other things on here, some of which go to the attributes or the advantages of oral fluid testing as identified by the federal government in 2019 with SAMHSA, in 2023 with DOT, as to reasons why they decided to allow lab-based oral fluid testing. And so some of these issues overlap, right? Or oral fluid testing becomes a possible solution to some of these challenges for employers. And that will factor in again into why oral fluid testing is going to grow in popularity in 2024 and beyond. This is what we know. Okay, let's set the stage a little bit with marijuana. I've got some a specific section in today's presentation on marijuana, and we'll get to that in a second. But the legalization of marijuana, unfortunately, has caused confusion among employers as to whether or not they have the right to test for marijuana. So that's number one. And as marijuana use increases, drug testing remains critical. We saw a lot of data in the 2023 Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index, which comes out every year, a valuable resource that's available to employers and providers. And a couple of things, and I don't have that in front of me to quote the direct specific statistics or percentages, but what we found from the DTI last year was that we're seeing a continued increase in marijuana positives and in post-accident positives for marijuana. And those post-accident positives for marijuana are higher in states that have legalized recreational marijuana versus states that have not. And that could still be a state that legalized medical marijuana, but not recreational marijuana. But in states like Colorado, California, Oregon, et cetera, that have legalized recreational use of marijuana, we're seeing a higher rate of post-accident positivity. And this goes to the whole issue about whether more people are using marijuana, and we know that from the federal government studies that come out every year, but also its impact, its direct impact on safety in the workplace. More employees using marijuana or being at work under the influence of marijuana, or perhaps just at work with marijuana in their system, and that's resulting in post-accident positivity increases. Now, that's not what the DTI doesn't draw that conclusion overtly, but you can look at the numbers and you can see that clearly seems to be the trend. And so that DTI information is valuable. Look at the last bullet. How a company tests for marijuana and what a company does with a positive result are the two big issues that are at the center of controversy right now and go to the whole California-Washington phenomenon that's unfolding, as we speak. And so those are the two issues that you see most often addressed in a legal marijuana law. How an employer can test for marijuana vis-a-vis California and Washington, and then what an employer can do with the positive result. I'm going to talk to that point specifically here in a second. So states that allow oral fluid testing, virtually all states. Okay, when it comes to lab-based oral fluid testing, there are only 3 states, Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii. And I think we're starting to see all 3 of those states probably beginning to remove any barriers to lab-based oral fluid testing. We know also that there are a number of states you'll see below that have voluntary laws and workers and unemployment comp regulations that come into play when we talk about sometimes lab-based, but specifically point of collection oral fluid testing. Those are all issues that you have to check out very carefully. But just recently, we saw legislation introduced in Alaska with their voluntary drug testing law, which up to this point has only allowed for urine testing, I believe, maybe hair testing also, but urine testing I know for sure. And they've now introduced legislation in Alaska that would allow for oral fluid testing as well. So we're starting to see movement in that direction toward oral fluid testing at the state legislative level also. But it's very important that if you're going to consider using oral fluid testing, you check those state laws because they will have direct impact. And I'm going to share some specific information on that as well in today's presentation. But as sort of a precursor to some other things I'm going to talk about, let's talk about California and Washington just for a minute. Like I said, I did an entire webinar on it recently with Quest and NDASA, and so it can take up an hour or longer. But I'm just going to cover it in maybe 4 or 5 slides here. So California AB 2188 specifically states, quote, it's unlawful for an employer to discriminate against a person in hiring, termination, so pre-employment, post-hire, covered there, right? Or any term or condition of employment, or otherwise penalize a person if that's close quote. Now, if the discrimination is based upon, among other things, and then quote, an employer required drug screening test that has found the person to have, quote unquote, non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites in their hair, blood, urine, or other bodily fluids. There are some exceptions in the building and construction industries, okay? But basically, pre-employment and post-hire testing, like random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion testing, for using a testing method that identifies the presence of a metabolite of cannabis rather than the parent drug itself, would not be allowed for testing for marijuana in the state of California. That law went into effect January 1st. Now, an interesting statement in AB 2188, quote, as science has improved, employers now have access to multiple types of tests that do not rely on the presence of non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. These alternative tests include impairment tests, which measure an individual employee against their own baseline performance, and tests that identify the presence of THC in an individual's bodily fluids. In other words, oral fluid testing. Oral fluid testing identifies the parent drug or parent THC, as opposed to urine testing, which identifies the presence of a metabolite of THC or cannabis. That's a big difference, right? So using the California language, it's almost directly pointing us toward oral fluid testing. Now let's look at Washington for a second. Passed a year later, but very similar to California, except it only applies to pre-employment testing or testing applicants for marijuana, okay? It, just like California, it's intended to protect the individual's use of cannabis or marijuana off the job and away from the workplace. And look at that last bullet there, a required drug test that indicates the presence of, and using the same terminology, non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites in the hair, blood, urine, or bodily fluid. Okay, a lot more exceptions, occupations and safety-sensitive type of jobs that are excluded. That's a different subject altogether. But look at this phrase that was found in the Washington law. This bill does not prohibit an employer from basing initial hiring decisions on scientifically valid drug screening conducted through methods that do not screen for non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites. In other words, oral fluid drug testing. Now, there are other testing methods like blood, for example, where you're going to identify parent THC, maybe breath as well, an emerging technology. You know, so it's available as a lab-based test through Quest. I know maybe other labs as well. There isn't a point of collection THC breathalyzer out there yet that can be used, but oral fluid testing as either a lab-based or a POCT rapid result test already exists, already been in use by employers for decades now. This language, as well as what we just read for California, would point us toward oral fluid testing as a way for employers to be able to continue testing for marijuana in California, applicants and employees, in Washington, pre-hire or job applicants. But oral fluid testing makes it possible for employers in these states to continue testing for marijuana in those circumstances that I just described. Now, the question then becomes, will other states follow California and Washington and pass similar type of restrictions on testing methods that identify solely the metabolite of cannabis rather than parent THC? And the answer to that is maybe, probably. You could look at states like California and New York. New York's already outlawed testing for marijuana, period, with some exceptions. And of course, none of these restrictions apply to employers covered under the DOT regulations. So none of the restrictions in California and Washington would apply to DOT covered employers. And of course, DOT's already approved lab-based oral fluid testing. We're waiting for some conditions to be met, but then that will be an option everywhere in the country. But it's important to note that the bottom line here is that employers have options because oral fluid testing exists and it doesn't rely on detecting the metabolite of marijuana, but parent THC itself, okay? So now I know we have on the call today employers and drug testing providers. I'm going to talk about how providers can discuss or talk about oral fluid testing with their clients, but this will be valuable information for employers as well because it'll tell you the kind of questions that you want to ask. So the advantages of oral fluid testing are many. And again, let me just state that I'm a proponent of any drug testing method that works, that can actually do what it says it can do. If it's legal, if it's accurate, and the question then becomes, is it practical for your workplace? So I love oral fluid testing, but I also like urine and hair testing as well. The advantages of oral fluid testing help to solve certain problems that some employers in certain industries or certain parts of the country may be grappling with right now, okay? So for example, oral fluid collections, the collection of the oral fluid sample is easy to do. It can take place anytime, anywhere, any time of the day. You don't need to make an appointment at an Occ Health Center or patient service center, because it can take place at the workplace with proctored testing or virtual collections. It can take place literally anywhere in the job applicant's home, for example. There's lots of different flexibility that's available with oral fluid testing as opposed to urine testing. And adulteration or drug test cheating becomes nearly impossible with oral fluid testing compared to urine testing, which has, been subject to all kinds of, an entire cottage industry of ways in which employees, job applicants attempt to cheat on a drug test, on a urine drug test specifically. In fact, I recently looked at a website that was offering advice and products that you could purchase to subvert a drug test. And their advice on being able to pass an oral fluid drug test was to stop using drugs. That was the best way to do it. I thought that says it all right there, right? Now, the question of legal defensibility is an interesting one, because now we do have federal regulations out there. And even if you're not covered under the DOT regulations and you choose to do oral fluid testing, you can follow those guidelines, those regulations as a guide in how to put together a legally defensible program. And as I mentioned, oral fluid testing is legal in virtually every state. There are some exceptions, as I mentioned, but it's a legally defensible drug testing method. And I've got a statement from SAMHSA coming up that I think will help to solidify that point, okay? One of the other great advantages of oral fluid testing is because we're detecting parent THC. Let's stay on the marijuana issue for a second. That drug use, marijuana in the system, becomes detectable in an oral fluid sample within minutes after usage. So somebody goes out to their car during their lunch break and they smoke a couple of joints, they come back into the workplace, they smell of marijuana, they're acting a little bit woozy, etc. You conduct an oral fluid test, and within about 15 minutes, let's say, of when that person smoked a couple of joints, they're going to test positive on an oral fluid test because it detects recent use, because it detects the parent drug. Now with urine, you're going to have a lag time of about 6 to 7 hours, generally speaking, before the metabolite becomes detectable in that urine sample. So if you collect a urine sample an hour or two after somebody comes back from their lunch break reeking of marijuana and acting like they're under the influence, that's probably not going to show up in that urine test, whereas it will with an oral fluid test. And that's the advantage of being able to detect the parent drug, which you can do with oral fluid. That's the advantage of being able to detect recent drug use. And that becomes a factor in a number of states that have legalized marijuana and require employers to show some evidence that the individual was impaired. We're not claiming, nobody's claiming that a drug test proves impairment, that we don't have that same legal standard for drug testing as we do with alcohol testing and the blood alcohol content levels that have been established by the federal government. But it does detect recent use in oral fluid because it's identifying the presence of parent THC as opposed to a metabolite of THC. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it makes proctored or virtual collections possible because oral fluid is such an easy sample to collect. It doesn't require an individual to use a bathroom or for the employer to turn off the hot water or anything like that. It can be observed 100% from start to finish, which eliminates drug test cheating, but also, or many drug test cheating methods, but also makes proctored or virtual collections a reality. It makes them possible, okay? So a lot of advantages, some considerations to take into account. I did mention that there's 3 states, at least right now, that don't allow lab-based oral fluid testing. I think we'll see that change. There is the need to manage the inventory of devices that are going to be in your workplace or at a collection site if you're still using a professional technician. but that your provider can help you take care of that. On the urine side, we always talk about shy bladder. On the oral fluid side, we talk about dry mouth syndrome. That's a possibility, just like shy bladder can be with urine testing. And the shorter window of detection, which I've got a slide coming up, is both a pro and, depending on your circumstances, a con of oral fluid testing. But I think it's becoming more and more one of the most sought after advantages of oral fluid testing. Now, there are some differences between lab-based and point of collection oral fluid testing, and I'm not going to go through all of these slides. I'll leave this up here for a second. But it really comes down to two factors. One, what do the state laws that apply to your company say about point of collection testing versus lab-based testing? There are some states that are a little bit more picky about point of collection testing. You may be in a state with a laboratory licensing law like New York, where it becomes a little bit problematic to do point of collection testing. Not impossible, but there are some challenges to it. Versus lab-based testing, which takes a little bit longer to get your result back, obviously 24 to 72 hours, or maybe a little bit longer, versus getting an immediate result. So all of those things come into play. And the second factor, in addition to the state laws, is what are your circumstances? What are your objectives? What are you trying to accomplish with your drug testing program? And that will dictate in large part how you drug test. So first, you need to know why you're drug testing. What are the goals and objectives you have? What do you hope to get out of this? And then you choose the drug testing method that will help you best meet those objectives. So keep that in mind as you consider different drug testing methods. With lab-based testing, as I mentioned, there's the turnaround factor in getting results back. If you're talking about urine testing, there's the subversion or drug test cheating factor to take into account. And then the costs. Now, the cost can vary. I'm going to show you some return on investment data here in a second. I'm going to warn you ahead of time. I just put in the numbers that I wanted to put in, but you can use the formula that I'm about to share with you and use your own numbers, okay? But cost becomes a factor as well, right? It may be that oral fluid testing costs more upfront, but the return on investment with soft dollar savings gives you a much bigger advantage, or vice versa, when you compare oral fluid testing with lab-based urine testing. But again, look at these are the numbers I put in, okay? You change them to whatever you want them to be. But for the purpose of this demonstration, let's talk about this a second, then we'll jump into some more specific issues. So we're talking about lab-based testing here. The price the end user pays for a collection with urine, let's say it's an average of 15, it can be lower, but it can obviously be much higher, especially with inflation the way it is right now. With oral fluid testing, that collector price can go away if you choose to do the collections in-house, administered by employees of the company, or with proctored testing by the donor, him or herself. The price the end user pays for the lab analysis, I put 18 for urine, 25 for oral fluid testing. You're also, with oral fluid, you're going to have some price for the device itself, the collection device, so that comes into play. But I put 25 here. I didn't put anything for confirmation. I'm bundling that into the whole price. And for MRO fee, I put an MRO fee of $5 for urine. I could have really put that in for oral fluid as well, because it's really strongly recommended that if you get a presumptive positive on an initial screen with oral fluid, you're going to want to send that result into a laboratory for confirmation testing. So I could have put that there, but leave it the way it is, and you can see the price difference, $38 versus $25 for urine versus oral fluid. Now, again, this is lab-based testing. If you look at the soft dollar costs, the difference, the gap between the cost of urine and oral fluid increases even more. With an oral fluid test, I can do that test on site in the workplace. Now, remember, I said we're going to take state laws into account. We're going to look at what our objectives are, and that's going to determine whether oral fluid testing is right for us. But if it is, you're potentially saving the time that it takes for a worker and possibly a supervisor or a job applicant to go to a collection facility and wait an hour or two or three for their opportunity to void a sample. Now, I was in a patient service center of a company recently to provide to give blood for a annual checkup I had coming up. And there were signs saying that they do not do drug testing collections at that site. That's interesting, right? Because a few years ago, they probably did. But now they're focusing on some more perhaps high dollar services that they can offer, and they don't want to do the drug test collections anymore. That's not true of all collection sites or patient service centers. But if you look at it that way, you're saving time by being able to do the oral fluid test at the workplace. Maybe it's a reasonable suspicion test. You're not going to send that person in their car to a collection site anyway without a supervisor along. But maybe you do it in the workplace. They test negative, it was something else, and they're back at work. And instead of being gone for an hour and a half, maybe longer, they're off the job for 15 minutes, maybe 30. And you can see by the dollar amount per hour that you're paying that individual, the savings is significant. You add it all up, and you're really saving a lot of money with oral fluid testing versus urine testing. Doesn't mean oral fluid testing is right for you, but that's a factor that you want to take into consideration. The actual cost savings, both in hard dollars and soft dollars. And if that's important to you, if that's part of the objective of how you're going to choose your drug testing method, then that becomes a valuable calculation to be aware of. So with that in mind, let's talk about oral fluid testing and marijuana. I just have a few slides on this, but I want to make this connection because this issue dominates how we do drug testing and how we're going to do drug testing in the future. So we know that marijuana testing is legal in virtually every state. New York's the one state that I'm not going to include in that to make it an even 50, but even in New York, there are exceptions to their prohibition on testing for marijuana in the workplace. Some states require evidence of recent use or evidence of impairment, which you're not necessarily going to get from a drug test, but it's important language to be aware of if it's in a law that applies to your company. Now, I get asked this question all the time. We're a multi-state employer. Which laws apply to our company? And the answer is all of them. So you need a drug testing policy that's maybe based on your home state with addendums for all the other states that have laws that maybe differ from the legal requirements that exist in your home state. So you may be in 30, 40 states, doesn't mean you need 30 or 40 addendums to your policy, but you may need several of them in order to take into account any legal requirements that differ from your home state. And as I say here, in some of those states that have legalized marijuana, there's language in there that refers to employers needing some other evidence of impairment besides a drug test result. And again, we're not saying that a drug test result proves impairment either legally or scientifically, but if you're in one of those states with that kind of language, you need to know that so that you're taking steps to pull together all the information that would justify adverse employment action in addition to a positive drug test result. Now, as I mentioned earlier, California and Washington have placed restrictions on how employers test for marijuana. In California, remember, that's both pre-employment and employee or post-hire testing, whereas in Washington, it's only pre-employment testing. So in other words, in Washington, you can test your workers with urine for marijuana on a reasonable suspicion, post-accident, or random test, because the restrictions in the law in Washington only apply to pre-employment testing at this point. Look at the last slide there, though. State law patterns for restrictions on marijuana testing may be used for the legalization of other drugs, psilocybin and magic mushrooms and other drugs that may have an impact on your workers, your employees' abilities to safely function in the workplace and do their jobs. We saw that in Oregon, where they decriminalized all drugs, including cocaine and heroin and fentanyl. And if you've been watching the news lately, you're seeing that there's a lot of buyer's remorse in Oregon as the rate of substance abuse has skyrocketed in the state of Oregon as a result of them removing any kind of legal restrictions on using these illicit drugs. Now, what is oral fluid testing? I'm not a scientist. Let me explain it in layman's terms, okay? It's looking at the saliva from the mouth, that you can take a sample of that oral fluid or that saliva, and it's going to show the presence of the parent drug, whatever drugs you're testing for, in that sample. And it's usually detectable within a handful of minutes, let's say 15 minutes to be safe, okay? It's collected using a device that's placed in the mouth, okay, that absorbs oral fluid onto that pad, or you're putting saliva or oral fluid directly into a vial. It's a fairly quick process. The donor and the collector are together the whole time, face to face, if you will, and that entire process is directly observed from start to finish 100%, which eliminates many of the common drug test cheating methods. It's a quick, easy way to conduct drug testing, or at least to conduct the collection. Now, this goes to the issue in California and Washington, right, with the identification of either the metabolite of a drug or the parent drug itself. So you can see the top line under the orange heading, we're looking at urine and hair testing, and that's where we're detecting a metabolite of THC. Whereas with oral fluid and breath, although as I said, it's a fairly new technology, but oral fluid and breath, you're detecting the presence of the parent drug or parent THC, Delta-9. So that's a significant difference between urine, hair versus oral fluid and breath. Now, this is the quote that I referred to earlier. This quote came from SAMHSA in 2019 when they issued their final regulations, excuse me, for lab-based oral fluid testing of federal workers. And the Department of Transportation, DOT, when they came out with their final regulations in May 2023, based those regulations in large part on the regulations that SAMHSA put out in 2019. One of the quotes from the SAMHSA guidelines or regulations that came out in 2019 that I know DOT had a significant hand in was this one. The scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has now been broadly established, and the advances in the use of oral fluid in detecting drugs have made it possible for this alternative specimen to be used in federal programs with the same level of confidence that has been applied to the use of urine. I think that's the most significant statement that I've ever seen on the validity of oral fluid drug testing. And many states have drug testing laws that have essentially punted on the issue of procedures for drug testing, how you conduct a drug test. They just defer to the federal regulations. They use all kinds of terminology in doing so. Sometimes they say DOT, sometimes they say SAMHSA, sometimes they say Part 40. Some of the older laws, and many of them are older laws, they'll refer to NIDA, for example. But in a lot of those laws, and especially states with voluntary drug testing laws like Florida and Tennessee, et cetera, or states with industry-specific laws like Illinois with public works contractors, where the procedural requirements of those laws simply defer to some federal regulations, whatever the terminology is that they chose to use in that particular state. With this statement here, and with those existing regulations from both SAMHSA and DOT, states that have this type of language in them become, available to employers that maybe weren't sure before if they could do oral fluid testing, but now with these federal regulations in place and the type of language that's in their state law, oral fluid testing becomes an option for them without any concerns or restrictions about whether or not it's permitted. In many of those states, it's simply deferring to the federal regulations, and you can use those federal regulations even if you're not covered by those federal regulations, even if you're not a DOT covered employer with truck drivers, for example, with the kinds of restrictions or requirements, better said, of the DOT regulations applying to your company. You can use these existing DOT regulations for oral fluid testing as a blueprint to put together a legally defensible program, even outside of a DOT required program. So those regulations become a way for you to put together a very strong, legally defensible drug testing program using oral fluid testing. The attributes are many. They're articulated in those SAMHSA and DOT preambles to their regulations. Samples are easier to collect, can take place anywhere, anytime, eliminates drug test cheating. Instant oral fluid testing, which is not part of the DOT or SAMHSA regulations. Those regulations only apply to lab-based testing. but instant or point of collection or rapid result, whatever terminology you choose to use, is an option that's available with oral fluid testing. It's something that, as I said, not permitted under the federal regulations, but there are no restrictions on oral fluid or rapid testing in California and Washington. There is a laboratory licensing law in California, but it does not specifically apply to the workplace. Most people have concluded that those restrictions do not apply to the workplace. So point of collection, rapid result testing permitted in California, and with oral fluid testing specifically. That's an advantage if you're looking for the attributes of not just oral fluid testing, but an instant oral fluid test. You're going to want to look for either a test device that is FDA cleared or has E&I clearance. That gives you that added level of assurance that you're using a device that works. But instant oral fluid testing may be right for you, depends on what your objectives are. There are lots of different testing methods to choose from today, right? Instant urine, lab-based urine, instant oral fluid, lab-based oral fluid, and hair testing, as well as breath, which is not on this chart, which is available right now as a lab-based test only. But if you just compare the key attributes of urine and oral fluid testing side by side, you can see that there are certain advantages that come into play that you need to be aware of. And down at the very bottom, detection of other drugs is critical because in many states, the state law dictates either which drugs you can test for or which drugs you must test for. And so you want to use a testing method that covers that entire drug test panel. Now, if you look at the window of detection, which I mentioned earlier, you can see that with breath, blood, and oral fluid, drugs become detectable almost immediately after use. You see that to the far left of this graphic. And then with breath, it's a shorter window of detection of maybe 2 to 3 hours, let's say 3 hours. With blood, it's going to go out for a number of days. Same with oral fluid, although with THC or marijuana, the window of detection is much shorter than days. Urine testing, we're going to have that lag time of 6 to 7 hours, but then you're going to have a window of detection of usually 3 to 4 days at the cutoff levels that we're talking about. Longer if you're ignoring that. With hair testing, which is a great drug testing method, especially for lifestyle or a person's drug use history type of screen, it's going to be 7, 8 days, maybe 9 days thereabouts before the metabolite of the drug becomes detectable in hair. But then you're going to have a window of detection that goes out for about 3 months. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. This is a very important study that came out in 2021 from the University of Sydney. They looked at 80 separate studies from around the world, and they concluded that depending on a lot of different factors, how THC is used, the task being performed by the individual, etc., that impairment, cognitive impairment, lasts between 3 and 10 hours from all these different studies they looked at from all around the world. The second bullet, their analysis indicated that impairment may last up to 10 hours if high doses of THC are consumed orally, but a more typical duration is about 4 hours when lower doses of THC are consumed via smoking or vaporization, and simpler tasks are undertaken. If it's a more complex type of task, where you're asking somebody to drive a delivery van, operate a forklift, etc., that type of impairment can last for longer periods, 6 to 7 or more hours in higher doses of when higher doses of THC are consumed, and these more complex tasks are being performed. Now, I've sat in some presentations with some really smart people where they've said that there are studies out there that show that the window of impairment for marijuana goes well beyond 10 hours, and I'm sure that's true. But just as a general rule, if we say that that window of impairment is about 3 to 10 hours, then you want a drug testing method that covers that entire period of time. You can see with urine that it's going to take 6, 7 hours before the window of detection opens up, and we've missed the first 70% of that window of impairment. With breath, that may be what you want, just a 2-3 hour window of detection. But if you're concerned about the window of impairment that takes place after that, then oral fluid testing is the only drug testing method that's really viable for the workplace, where you're going to detect recent use within 15 minutes after usage, and it's going to extend throughout that entire 3 to 10 hour window of impairment vis-a-vis the University of Sydney study. Very important to take that into consideration, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have on that. Now, I'm getting a little bit tight on time. You can have access to these slides. We're happy to share them. Let me just kind of breeze past a couple of slides here because I want to get to a couple of major points coming up on things that you should do, okay? You should know the laws that apply to you. If you're a multi-state employer, look at all the states that are applicable to your company. And as you put your policy together and you're considering moving to oral fluid testing, be as comprehensive as possible. Put in there how you conduct oral fluid testing. Is it lab-based? Is it POCT? Is it a combination of oral fluid testing and urine, or oral fluid testing and hair? Put that in there, as well as any other details that any state laws may require. And use a testing method, if possible, that has either been not endorsed, maybe that's not the right word, but has been approved by or sanctioned by SAMHSA, if possible. If you're using a laboratory, we're still looking for at least 2 labs to become SAMHSA certified for oral fluid testing, but there are other laboratory certifications out there besides SAMHSA. Use a SAMHSA certified lab, as I mentioned, and an FDA cleared POCT device or an E&I cleared device, one that's approved for employment and insurance use. But look at those kinds of things. They will factor into the overall legal defensibility of your program. And don't ignore those legal marijuana laws. They come into play and they can have a tremendous impact on your drug testing program and whether or not you're going to do point of collection or lab-based, if you're going to use urine, hair, or oral fluid, or some combination of all 3 of them. And then just in conclusion, the good news is that outside of the DOT regulations, you can begin using oral fluid testing right now. And I think that's one of the things that's really going to sort of catapult oral fluid testing, as a very popular drug testing method, because the majority of employers that conduct drug testing are doing so outside of the federally mandated guidelines of DOT, for example. Contact your drug testing provider like WANFO, for example, the sponsor of today's presentation. They can help you identify your objectives. They're going to help you put your policy together, get your supervisors trained, etc. Those are all things that somebody should help you do, because as you switch to oral fluid testing, there are a lot of changes that you need to make to your program. They're all very doable. They're all sort of easy 1, 2, 3 steps, but you need to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row, because as you put the program together, you want your employees and your job applicants to have that level of comfort and confidence in the program that you put together, that you're doing it right, okay? This is a little bit more of what I talked about earlier, reviewing your existing policy. But with that, let me conclude just by saying that we're about to launch our 2024 Drug Testing Industry Survey. We'll release those results at the NDASA conference in May in Hershey, Pennsylvania. There's a presentation, roundtable discussion, I forget what they call it there at NDASA, taking place today within about 10 minutes. It's a town hall, that's what they call it, where they're going to have somebody from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration on the call to answer questions about the DOT regulations, and you could ask questions about the timing of when those oral fluid guidelines will become usable for covered employers. That's all stuff that's available, but we're going to ask those questions of you, of drug testing providers, and of employers when we do our 2024 surveys. So let's open it up to questions now. If you have any questions, throw that out to the audience now. Jessica, what have we got for questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. As we get into questions, just a reminder, we are going to be sending you out a link to the recording from today. We also are going to be sending you out the slides, as Bill mentioned. So if you want to refer back to those, just know that it's going to come to you in an email. If you're here today, you're on my list, so don't stress. We'll make sure that we get that information sent out to you. But we do have several questions, Bill. One of the questions that came in today is, will more states pass laws similar to Washington and California? And if so, how will that affect the legality of drug testing overall?
Well, I've written on that subject a lot in 2023. I believe drug testing is safe. It's legal now. It's going to continue to be legal. even if the federal government did something to legalize or decriminalize marijuana, to move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act, I don't think it's going to affect the legality of testing for marijuana or drug testing, generally speaking. I think we probably will see a handful of states pass similar laws to California and Washington, but right now I think they're waiting, they're watching, they're looking to see how this goes over in both of those states. Tons and tons of unanswered questions for both California and Washington, and so I think there's going to be a lot of adjustments made, maybe even some amendments to those two laws before you see other states really jump into it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned there are 3 states that do not allow lab-based oral fluid testing. I have 2 questions. One, will you just remind us of those 3 states again? And then do you have any explanation or understanding as to why those states may not allow oral fluid testing?
Yeah, so the 3 states, and keep in mind, these restrictions only apply to lab-based testing. They're Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii. Interestingly, in Hawaii, they allow point of collection oral fluid testing, but they have a restriction on lab-based oral fluid testing. I think that will change now that DOT's put out these regulations. As to why these states have these issues in place, I can only tell you that they're old laws. They've been on the books for a long time. And it was really, even though oral fluid testing's been around for decades, as a friend of mine put it earlier today on a call, oral fluid testing's been around since the last century. That makes it sound old, you know, it was only 24 years ago. But the point is, it's been around for a long time. Despite that, though, a lot of drug testing laws were written back in the late 80s in some cases, during the 90s, and they were based on, you know, what was out there at the time, what was popular and what was commonly used at the time. And that was mostly lab-based urine testing. We've seen a lot of drug testing laws change since those early days. And as I mentioned, even Alaska has a piece of legislation right now that would specifically add oral fluid testing to the approved drug testing methods under the state's voluntary drug testing law. So I think we'll see those things change in Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii. It may take a little bit more time, but the federal regulations, I think, are the impetus for that. The fact that the government has endorsed oral fluid testing and made oral fluid testing the only recent use detection drug testing method endorsed by the federal government, I think will weigh heavily when those states look at updating their laws to reflect these new regulations.
Okay, thank you for that information. That kind of leads into the next question. Is it possible then for a company to use urine and oral fluid testing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now again, check the state laws that apply to you. Make sure that there's no restriction on how you want to conduct those testing methods. For example, point of collection testing, which is legal in most states, might have some conditions that apply in certain states. But you could have, say, a pre-employment testing program using urine and using oral fluid for post-accident reasonable suspicion and random. Or some other combination thereof. So the answer to that question is yes, it does require that you modify your policy to reflect that flexibility, that you train your people within the company who oversee your drug testing program to know when to use urine and when to use oral fluid, or are we going to use one as a backup in case somebody has a shy bladder situation or a dry mouth situation, etc. So the simple answer is yes, you can in virtually every state, but you want to make sure you check with those state laws, you modify your policy, you train your supervisors, educate your employers on it, and you have consistent guidelines in place that are followed consistently for when to use which testing method.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Let's circle back for just a minute to when we were talking about oral fluid in Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii. You mentioned, the evolving legislation from the DOT. Do we have any idea when we are going to have 2 different labs certified to conduct DOT oral fluid testing?
Well, that I don't have an answer to that. I've been asked that question, I don't know how many times since the start of the year. If I had to guess, I would say at best we'll see something towards the end of 2024, but maybe even into 2025. But the bottom line here is that it's not just the certification of 2 laboratories that can conduct lab-based oral fluid testing. Keeping in mind that many laboratories conduct lab-based oral fluid testing right now. They do it maybe under some alternative certification program that they qualify for. But there are other conditions that have to be met. The people who do the collection of the samples have to be trained in the specific devices that they're going to be using. MROs have to go through the training process. A lot of things have to come into play. And so because there's so many moving parts, I think it'll be later rather than sooner, but I would love to be, proven wrong on that. I think the most important thing for employers to keep in mind, though, is that this train has left the station. I can't foresee any situation in which DOT or SAMHSA, for that matter, would rescind these regulations. I think we're going in that direction. The train's left the station. And I think a lot of non-DOT covered employers can start using those regulations sort of as a blueprint to put a non-DOT program together with some level of confidence and comfort in the legal defensibility of the program that they're following, even though they're not necessarily required to do so. But I think you'll see a lot of states sort of defer to those new final regulations for oral fluid testing issued by SAMHSA and DOT as well. And so that'll sort of become the de facto right way to do oral fluid testing in a similar way that the DOT regulations have become sort of the blueprint for how to do lab-based urine testing over the last 30-something years. But it's going to take a while before I think it's going to take a little while before those oral fluid testing regulations are out there. I've heard of companies that are already starting to send in oral fluid samples, and of course, those samples can't be used for DOT purposes, and they have to correct that. So when it happens, it'll be big news. Everybody will be talking about it. We'll probably do 6 webinars on it, and you'll know it's happening. But like if you're a member of NDACE or SAPA, or you're a client of a drug testing provider like WAMFO, for example, thank you, WAMFO, for sponsoring today's presentation. You're going to get the news. Current Consulting Group will be putting that out as well. But if you're a member of NDACE or SAPA, it's going to be big news when it happens.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Bill. We are coming close to the top of the hour, so I just have one more question. We have a few other questions that have come in, and so if that is you and we haven't gotten to your question, we will answer your question offline. But the last question you mentioned, later in the presentation, you mentioned proctor testing. What is that, and what advantages does that have for employers?
Well, so proctor testing, there are a lot of different terms for that. It could be virtual drug testing, video observed, or remote video observed collections. But it's where the donor is in one location and the collector or person observing the collection is in a completely different location. And through a special app, they're able to observe the donor doing their own collection in a way. Now, that's not feasible with urine testing, right? And would be difficult and cumbersome with hair testing, but oral fluid testing plays into proctor testing perfectly because the collection process is so easy to do. There's no privacy issues. There's no matching of genders between the donor and the collector, et cetera. So I think you'll see more of that going forward. I think that's a really viable way in which, for employers that are looking to speed up the process, to remove some of the barriers, and to make drug testing easier, I think you'll see proctored testing or virtual collections grow in popularity. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it's already starting to catch on. I think we'll see a lot of that in the oral fluid testing regulations from DOT and SAMHSA, which don't include proctored testing, are making oral fluid testing more popular, or a viable option or alternative for people to consider. And then I think proctored or virtual collections just expand those possibilities for employers that are looking to sort of streamline the process, cut costs, et cetera. So, but that's what it is, and I think it's going to grow in popularity. There are a lot of indications of that.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. We are at the top of the hour, and on behalf of Current Consulting Group and WANFO USA, we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded and you'll receive instructions informing you how to access the recording via email, as well as information about the continuing education credits from SHRM and from CCDAP. If you were with us for today's entire presentation, we'll send you those activity IDs. Also, we're going to hop on over to INDACE's Town Hall. If you're interested, I put that link into the chat section if you wanted to and you didn't already have that information. So that is available to you as well. Thank you again for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar.